Okay, just got back from the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting, and this one was very eventful. Today, what we're going to do is give you an insider's look into one of these theological conferences, and maybe perhaps spill a little tea on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. For those of you who don't know, the Evangelical Theological Society, ETS, is the largest annual gathering of evangelical academics, apologists, and pastors. It is a place where new discoveries are announced and where people network and buy deeply discounted books. In this video, we are going to give you some of the insider experience of ETS, including some of the conference drama. We're also going to let you know some of the highlights of the papers I happen to attend. Now, once you get registered at one of these conferences, the first thing you get is a goodie bag. Okay? And in this particular conference, what you get is books and book samples. And you also get them as you sort of go around the exhibitor booths too. Now, the books I got this year, I'll start with the samples here. I got the Net Bible's Abide Bible Journal. Now, this is a sample of the book of Mark. And what it is it's the Bible on one side of the page and a place for you to write journal notes on the other. So it's kind of a way to allow you to comment on it as you read it. So that's the first sample. The second sample was the NIV Application Bible. Now, this is a very small sample, but it gives you a sort of a look at what their application Bible is like. And I'll crack open the cover here, and what you see is a glossy colored translation of the NIV with study notes and maps. And I have to say, this one looks really good. This one looks really nice. The printing is clear. The maps are beautifully done. Lots of good notes. So that was a sample of the NIV Application Bible. The third sample is something you don't see too much at conferences like this, which is a sample of a hymnal called the Sing Hymnal. Okay? And it's published by Crossway Books. Now, we'll talk about Crossway again a little later on. But it's just more or less a up-to-date version of various hymns. So it's meant for a modern audience, but it's a hymnal, essentially. And then we get into the full books. And we got several of them this year. The first is Justice Awakening, How You and Your Church Can Help End Human Trafficking by Eddie Boone. All right, it's a small book, but this is one of the free books that we were given at the conference. We were also given, at registration, Transformed into the Same Image, Constructive Investigations into the Doctrine of Deification, edited by Paul Copan, Michael M.C. Reardon. Okay? So that's a freebie that we got at registration. So it's a full book, about 350 pages. So I don't know exactly what the doctrine of deification is going to be in this particular context, but we'll see. And then at one of the booths, we got Delighting in the Old Testament Through Christ and For Christ by Jason S. DeRushi. Okay. So that was a book that you had to get. You signed up for a mailing list, essentially, an email list, and then they gave you this book. So this was a freebie that was also Crossway book. So, and this was being given out by a seminary of all places. So we'll hear more from them in the future. And then finally, of the initial freebies, was a academic journal called Theo Global Journal. Now, this is a special edition on the attributes of God. So it's a anthology. It's for a journal. It's pretty beefy. It's like 260 pages. It's published by Sola Publications, so which tends to be a Protestant press. Okay, so that was a free academic journal we got at the conference. Okay, and you typically got all those books and samples at registration, or shortly after when you went through the book room. Now, the conference began on Wednesday, November 20th, and the first paper I sat through was hosted by the NEAS, the Near Eastern Archaeology Society. Now, for those of you not familiar with the NEAS, they used to be a reputable archaeology society for evangelicals. Unfortunately, they've been taken over by the Associates for Biblical Research, also called ABR, and now the NEAS is more or less a mouthpiece for ABR's agenda. But the first paper I sat through was entitled A Proposed Identification for Silu in Elamarna 288 by Scott Stripling. Now, if you've been on my channel for any length of time, you probably recognize the name Scott Stripling. He is the de facto leader of ABR and the leading proponent of the early Exodus date position. He gave a paper that posited that She'iri in Elamarna letter 288 should be identified as Shiloh instead of Silu or Charu as Moran and Rainey suggested. Now, before getting into his suggestion as to how to translate Shiri, he gave a very long historical lead-up where he claimed that the Apiru in the Amarna letters were the Israelites, and that the Egyptians colonized Canaan as an extension of its iron-fisted Egyptian empire. We should note that Stripling also leads the dig at Shiloh, which is one of ABR's best cash cows. So he kind of has Shiloh on the brain. This doesn't mean that Stripling is wrong, only that he has a bias here. Now, after the paper, I had to leave the session to give my own paper. But later that afternoon, I was walking to the book room, and Stripling just blew past me in a rush. And I thought, whew, fantastic, I don't have to talk to him. Okay? And the corridor's empty. The corridor is absolutely empty. There's nobody there except him and me, and he just blew past me, and I'm just thinking, wow, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. But then he turned abruptly and said to me, "Did you call out my name?" I said, "Nope, certainly wasn't me." Nobody called out his name. And he waited by the escalator for me to catch up. Okay? Because he's much more ambulatory than I am. And we took the escalator down to the book floor together. I still said nothing. But he was acting twitchy. I mean, really twitchy. And I could tell it was killing him that he didn't know my opinion on his paper. Finally, he asked, "What do you think of my paper?" Now, I did tell him that the main point of his paper had merit. But his scholarship and history leading up to his main point were a train wreck. I told him that the scholarship for Rainey he got all wrong. Rainey did not translate Shiri as Charu but Mount Seir, which is actually a better identification. It's not as bad as Charu, but I told him that his translation is probably better. I also told him that he completely understood the nature of Egyptian hegemony. Now, his response to that was, quote, "That's not what I read," end quote. I did inform him that the academic consensus among Egyptologists today wouldn't call the Egyptian New Kingdom an empire. It would call it a hegemony. And this is almost universally true. Almost every Egyptologist will call the Egyptian kingdom a hegemony because it more accurately reflects the political situation between Egypt and Canaan. I also told him that his analysis of the Apiru was completely lacking because he characterized the Apiru as conquering invaders instead of mercenaries working for the Amorites. His response was, quote, "Well, I disagree." Okay? That's a "don't confuse me with the facts" kind of response. So then, that was my fun with Stripling. But then I had to start to go and get ready for my own paper session, and it's usually courtesy to attend your session a little early so the moderator knows that you're there and you're going to show up for the paper. It's also so he gives you last minute instructions that if you need to respond to, you can. Like he told me that the actual paper length wasn't going to be 40 minutes, but 30 minutes. Okay? Now, when you're told this, you prepare for a 40-minute paper. It's up to the moderator whether he allows questions after that or not. So he was giving people a generous amount of time for questions. So it's like, okay, 40-minute paper versus 30-minute paper. I've done this enough that I know ahead of time that I might need to cut things drastically down. So during the next couple papers, I was in the audience striking out pieces of my paper in red because that's what you prepare for. You don't prepare for... You prepare to fill the whole 40 if you need, but cut it if you have to. So once you've been through this a couple times, it comes as second nature. But one of the papers I sat through as I was preparing for my own talk was Adorning the Gospel or Stripping It Bare, Case Studies in Christian Nationalism by Michael Laframboise. Now, in this paper, Laframboise gives a critique of the work The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. Laframboise made the case that Christian nationalism is neither Christian nor patriotic, but a hybrid of legalism and an idealistic monolithic ethnocentrism. Now, Laframboise limited his critique to just Wolfe's book, but that was enough to scare me. Among the things suggested in the book is making church attendance legally mandatory. That is, if you don't go to church, you get fined or go to jail. Laframboise also criticized Wolfe's ideas for the imposition that it places upon religion. Now, you might think that Christian nationalism is sort of gives religion a lot of slack, but it really doesn't. It doesn't really favor it. It actually places a lot of restrictions upon various practices within Christianity. For example, one of the things that Wolfe suggested was making things like where the pulpit is positioned on the stage a legal requirement. So then you're not free then to move your pulpit around the stage or altar, because now if you do, you could be fined or your church shut down because your pulpit is not in the right place. Now, Laframboise noted that in Wolfe's book, he highly extols monolithic cultures as national ideals and stated that such notions could easily slip into racism. The book is not as explicit as Wolfe himself is about this. So Laframboise didn't get too much into the racism aspect as much as saying that there's a potential for racism here. Oddly enough, at the exact same time Laframboise was giving his paper, Stephen Wolfe was giving a paper elsewhere in the building advocating for his Christian nationalism. Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy happened to be at that paper and told me when he asked Wolfe about his idea of monolithic cultures, Wolfe immediately went into a racist rant. So there's no sort of slipping in. He definitely crosses that line. Now, the next paper I attended, and the one immediately before my own, was titled The New Gods Are Dying, Carl Henry's Blueprint for an Effective Evangelical Witness by Matthew Akers. This paper basically takes Carl Henry's idea that modern culture is little more than the gods or idols of the ancient world, but assuming new names. Akers tried to make a high theological case that one can engage the culture by treating culture as a vehicle for idolatry. Now, I don't think Akers' case was very sound, and frankly, his paper wasn't even that interesting. Culture is a mixed bag. It's not purely evil. Sure, Satan works through culture, but so does God. And I think it is a better idea to engage the culture through culture instead of railing against it. In many ways, it's the same sort of solution that was done in the 1960s when Christianity pulled out of the movie industry. Well, yeah, okay, you've now taken what little influence you've had in the movie industry and sort of given it over to the other side. It is an obsolete solution that has a proven track record of failure. Now, the next paper I attended was the one I actually gave. And my paper was entitled Reaching the Next Generation on YouTube, How to Successfully Engage a New Cultural Context. Now, in this paper, I gave advice to recent seminary students, teachers and preachers, and directors of large parachurch organizations on how to be effective for Christ on YouTube. And yes, Mr. Empty Conjecture made an appearance at the paper. We had a packed room, well, at least by ETS standards. Before I gave the paper, I was told that I'd be allowed, said, 30 minutes and last minute questions, and I thought that's fine. 10 minutes of questions, no problem. They're never going to go that long. Yeah, right. So, after the paper, and my paper was the last paper in the session, so there was no more paper, and it was lunch break, we had 30 minutes of questions. This doesn't happen very often at ETS, and I even did a book signing there, so as far as papers go, this was very unusual. Now, after my paper, I was supposed to have lunch with a group of Christian YouTubers, including Inspiring Philosophy and Christian Idealism, aka Kyle Alander. However, as I was leaving the hotel, I bumped into Gavin Ortland. And he told us that he was viewing ETS as a vacation, which I totally respect. He said at least at ETS, he didn't have any of his kids throwing chicken McNuggets at him from the back of the car. I thought that was priceless. We also discussed our mutual friend, Kip Davis, and how it sort of took him off guard. Now, I have to admit, Ortland is a great guy, and we even talked about doing a collaboration together, which I would really love to do with him. After lunch, I then went to the book room, where I met with one of our channel regulars, Nathan Yadone. We also had a couple of long discussions with Fuller Seminary and the Bible Seminary, which were, ironically, across the aisle from each other. Now, it's ironic because Fuller is a very liberal seminary, and the Bible Seminary is essentially ABR's Bible college. So, ideological opposites right across the aisle from each other. It couldn't have been better juxtaposed if they planned it. I also met, during that time in the book room, Sean McDowell, who was admittedly uncomfortable to meet me, given the events that precipitated from the debate with Titus Kennedy, but the meeting was cordial. Now, anyone who's been to these conferences know how sort of taxing it is. And frankly, my producer and I were both exhausted. So I took her back upstairs, and frankly, she took a nap that I desperately wanted to, but after I took her upstairs, I returned to the book room. And just as I left the elevator, I was walking past a group of ruffian apologists who were hanging out in front of the elevator. Then Archer Adurian of Apologia Center pointed at me and said, quote, "We were just talking about you." At first, I wasn't sure he was talking about me because, frankly, the area was really crowded. There was a lot of people packed in that area right in front of the elevator. So I turned around to face Michael Brown. I said hello, and he responded, "We sure need Christian Egyptologists." Now, I nodded as I talked. I still wasn't sure they were actually talking about me, because there are other Christian Egyptologists. But then he suggested I come onto his channel and talk about Egypt and the Bible, perhaps sometimes in January. And frankly, I got along very well with Brown. He was he was kind of funny. It was an entertaining talk. Now, after talking to Brown, I still tried to make my way to the book room, and then got stopped in the hallway again. And I heard this, "Hey, Dr. Falk!" And it was Sam Shamounian. And he said to his friend, "Oh, I love this guy," and then gave me this massive bear hug. And he said, "This guy is fantastic on the Exodus, but don't do the early Exodus around him." I'm still wondering, can I breathe? I mean, if you ever meet Sam Shamounian, he's a big guy. Big guy. And when he gives you a bear hug, I mean, you feel it. I mean, it's just, whoa. I told him, well, I'm not that impatient with people, but, even God's patience is not without limits. So, after that, I then bumped into Christian idealism again. And, he asked me about why secular scholars see the biblical authors as conflicting with each other, and was this a problem of method? And I said, well, yeah, it is. And I talked to him briefly about univocality versus canonicity. So, this is what happens at a conference like this. You try to get to one place, and people keep hitting you up all the way along the hall. So by the time you actually get to the book room, if that's it, where you're going, you don't often have a lot of time. And that's what happened in this case. By the time I got through with Arthur and Michael Brown, it was then Shamounian, then it was Christian idealism. And, between the three of them, it was like almost an hour. So I went to the book room and stayed there until it closed, and then went back up into my room. And I took the elevator up with, of all people, William Lane Craig. I introduced myself to him and gave him my card. I did resist the urge this time to yank his chain. I mean, last time I saw him at a conference, I yanked his chain, and probably shouldn't have done that. But this time I resisted the urge. That night we went to the Evangelical Philosophical Society reception and said hello at the Chosen People reception. Now, we went to the Evangelical Philosophical Society because my producer is a member of that society. Fortunately, both receptions were uneventful. So that covers Wednesday, November 20th. The next morning, November 21st, I attended a couple more papers hosted by the NES. And we're only going to cover one in this first part, and we'll continue covering the rest of them on the next part. But the first paper of this session was Israel and the Tribes of Israel in New Kingdom Topographic Inscriptions by Peter van der Veen. Now, we have mentioned Peter van der Veen on occasion on this channel. He's an Old Testament professor from Germany. He is also an early Exodus dater, but he's not the same kind of early Exodus dater that you find generally in ABR or NES circles. He's more a disciple of David Rohl, so he believes in revisionist histories. As such, he has a history of controversial work. Veen is best known for his work on the Berlin pedestal and the Mount Ebal curse amulet. In this particular paper, Van der Veen makes the argument that he found the name Israel and 3 names of Israelite tribes in 18th dynasty toponym inscriptions, and concludes that those toponyms prove a 15th century Exodus date. During the paper, he makes the following 4 claims. 1. The Berlin pedestal should be transliterated as Yah-Shah-Ir and translated as Israel. This inscription is from the 18th dynasty based upon linguistic features, and Veen claims that in the paper that there was no real opposition to his identification of Israel on this pedestal. He also claimed that the single reed leaf can be transliterated as a Y, and the Shah, the bed of papyrus reeds, had its letter R dropped as a feature of Middle Kingdom Egypt. Okay? That's his first claim. His second claim is that Isser should be translated as Asher. Isser is close to the city of Kadesh, and then Veen asserts that this must be Kadesh on the Orontes. His third claim is that the Shasu Rabbana, the Shasu of Reuben, found on the Soleb inscription, must be the tribe of Reuben, and is therefore this toponym is located in northern Canaan and represents the tribal holdings of Reuben. And then fourth, Thakar is a toponym for the tribe of Issachar. Now, after the paper, this is where sort of the drama begins. The moderator only allowed questions, no comments. I tried to respond to the paper. I said I had a few comments, and Stripling, who moderated the session, said, "No comments!" Realizing I had only one opportunity to say anything at all, I said, "Your transliterations are linguistic nonsense," and then they completely cut me off after that. Now, we have to emphasize how unusual this is at an academic conference. ETS is not supposed to be an echo chamber. It's an academic conference where people present papers. Those papers are then critiqued by the audience. And there's a very important reason why this is the normal course of action at an academic conference. The people in the audience are supposed to kick the tires on the paper so that if the paper is ever published, the person knows the weaknesses and can address them and not look like an idiot. So, while a good moderator will not allow someone to run out the clock with a speech, not allowing any comments at all is outrageous, particularly with a paper as controversial as this one. However, we should say also that many of his claims are simply not true. For example, Veen claims the inscription should be dated to the 18th dynasty based upon the linguistic features, but he completely ignores the carving features, which peg it to the 19th dynasty. So, he's cherry-picking the evidence here, but it's really funny how early Exodus date proponents often say there is no opposition to their ideas. For example, like Petrovich says this, as does Titus Kennedy. Now, I'm not really sure why they do this, other than to pretend that their views are so strong, nobody dares oppose them. Yeah, right, sure. But there was also a methodological problem with Veen's main hypothesis, that ethnyms from Dynasty 18 prove a 15th century Exodus. The fact is that names were reused. Many Semitic names are not original to Jacob or his sons. Many of the names have been reused since at least the Middle Bronze Age. So, even if there were 18th dynasty toponyms that are the same as the tribes of Israel, it doesn't prove a one-to-one identification, nor does it prove a 15th century exodus. That aside, there were problems with Vine's identifications. First, Vine's transliteration of Yashair, the so-called Israel, is linguistic nonsense, like I said in the comment. The normal way to transliterate that toponym is Yashair. You could make an argument that the reed leaf and vulture as Ia, that would be the normal way to do it. You could even stretch it to claim that it was a diphthong that should be translated as Y, but not Y aleph. You can make an argument for either one, Ia or Y, but never both. It's like having your cake and eating it too. And a single reed leaf by itself cannot be transliterated as Y, which is how he seems to be treating these single reed leaves. So I don't know where he gets the warrant for that, because you won't find it in any standardized Egyptian language text. Moreover, Shah is not evidence that a letter R dropped out. That is not a feature of Middle Kingdom Egyptian, but a feature of late Egyptian. So he got his history of languages backwards. And it is incredulous to think that the letter R dropped out of Israel in Dynasty 18, but somehow was preserved in Dynasty 19 on the Merneptah Stela. Again, his history of ancient languages is backwards here. The whole proposition is complete nonsense, and shows that van der Veen knows nothing about the Egyptian language. Second, Veen mistranslated Iser. It should be Issa, with a double S and an aleph. This means that this toponym is unlikely to be Asher that has a single sibilant S. Moreover, Issa is located among places in Lebanon, Syria, and Mesopotamia, for example, the Euphrates. So Issa is actually more likely to refer to the kingdom of Assur, Assyria, not Asher, the Israelite tribe. Third, the Shasu of Reuben, as he quotes, comes from the Soleb inscription, which happened to be near the Shasu of Seir. This means that the Shasu of Reuben cannot be the tribe of Reuben, because Reuben's tribal holdings were on the Jordan side of the Jordan River between Moab and Ammon. That's the area of the Heshbon and Arnon. So, even if he was correct about this translation to Reuben, he's still wrong, because this Shasu of Reuben is in the wrong place. And then finally, Sakar is a real stretch to make it Issachar, and it's nothing but empty speculation. So it was clear from hearing Veen's paper that van der Veen is incompetent at Egyptian transliteration and knows nothing about ancient geography or Egyptian toponym lists. This paper was a pig's breakfast, and the NAES ran interference for van der Veen. I was later asked by somebody, why wouldn't they let you speak? And I told them it was to protect Veen from being embarrassed. And the reason why they protected him from being embarrassed was so that Stripling and ABR could solidify their alliance between different camps of early daters. Because remember, van der Veen is from the David Roll camp of early date Exodus believers. whereas ABR is in that James Orr camp. So they have different ideologies, but they share that ever important 1446 date. And it's really important for ABR, with their declining support and declining numbers, to shore up that support. This is the whole reason why Veen is involved in the Mount Ebal curse amulet fiasco, which we're going to talk about on the next part of these videos. But there was one other aspect that came out of this too that was really interesting. My single comment at that paper piqued the interest of the person who happened to be sitting beside me during the paper. And that person was Roger Young. Now, Roger is an ABR bigwig. He was a really important figure in the days when Bryant Wood ran ABR. He was like the number 2 guy at ABR. Okay, so he was really important back in the day. His most important contribution was his argument for the early Exodus date from the 17 Jubilee cycles. See the card above. So, after I was caught off, Roger looked at my name tag, and he said, "You're a late dater." Okay? And I said, "And you're Roger Young." He asked me, "Why do you think Veen is wrong?" And the paper's still going on as he's asking this, so it'd be rude to talk in the back. And I told him I'd be happy to talk about with him after the lecture. Well, after the lecture, we stepped out in the hallway, and almost immediately Roger changed the subject. His first thing he said after we got in the hall was, "What about the Shasu of Yahweh? That proves the early Exodus date." I said, "Well, it's Shasu of Yahu, and we aren't sure what Yahu is supposed to be. Yahu could be Jehu, Yahiwan, or it could be Yahweh, but we just don't know." And he replied, "You're making an absence of evidence argument." Now, I'm thinking to myself, that's not an absence of evidence argument. And are you sure you're using that correctly? But I said to him, no, I'm saying we have insufficient evidence to make a determination. That's not an absence of evidence argument. Now, to this, Rogers said, only the Israelites worshipped Yahweh. And I told him that, well, that's an assertion for which you don't have warrant. Assertions are not evidence. And it's at that point a bystander piped in. "What about Balaam? Didn't he worship Yahweh?" And then Roger said, "Who?" Now, I couldn't believe that Roger said that. And he repeated it. And, it's Balaam, I said, "Balaam? That's the guy with the talking donkey?" You kind of wonder where biblical literacy is today. I mean, even amongst, say, the older set who grew up with the Bible, And Roger said, "Well, I don't know about that." At that point, Roger was visibly angry and agitated. To say Roger was furious at how the conversation was going was an understatement. I actually had to say, "Calm down, Roger. We're just having a conversation. There's no need to get angry." And then I told him that God not being known by the name Yahweh is restricted to Abraham and not the other nations. However, even if Yahu is Yahweh, the Shasu of Yahu still cannot be the Israelites, since the Soleb inscription places them near Shasu of Seir, which means this toponym is located in Edom. And the Israelites never traveled through Edom. They were forbidden to travel through Edom without permission, which they never got. To which Roger said, "Oh, I don't know about that." So with that said, we had to return to the meeting room for the next paper. And as we entered the room, Douglas Petrovich passed by. And Roger said to Petrovich, I'm having an argument with David Falk. And Petrovich only said, have fun with that. Roger wanted help, and Petrovich blew him off. Nice. Nice. Okay, we are going to stop part 1 here. We have covered about the first day and a half of the conference. Next week, we are going to discuss the rest of the conference, including the latest on the Mount Ebel curse amulet. We hope you enjoyed part 1 of our recollections and insider's view of the ETS conference and learned something. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.